Thank you all for coming. Welcome to our first program of 4 straight days of programs dealing with civil rights in celebration, commemoration, you might say, of the 50th anniversary of the historic landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. This program is sponsored by the Missoula Public Library Foundation, and there are flyers on the table behind you describing the foundation and what they have done for the library over the years. We hope that you'll all grab one of those. I probably should have put one on each of your seats to make sure that you grab one. But Foundation does a lot of wonderful things for this library and has over the years. A lot of our computer equipment, microfilm reader printers were purchased with Foundation funds. They have sent over the years a lot of staff to continuing education opportunities, funded that for us. Just these little extra things that we wouldn't be able to do, things that don't come out of the regular library budget. The Foundation has helped us with a great deal, so they're a tremendous boost to the library and a real asset to the community. And they are sponsoring this series of programs, forums, all of this week. We're really excited about not only tonight's program, but what's going to be going on here the rest of the week. Tomorrow evening, we have a panel of 3 people dealing with the issue of civil rights for gay Americans, focusing especially on Montana. We are going to do a screening of the video that some of you may have seen dealing with gay students in Montana high schools. That will begin at 6 p.m. and it will be followed at 7 with the panel of three people. Carl Olson of Montana Pride will be here, as well as Betty Kievsky of the Montana Human Rights Network, who did the video, and Reverend Gene Larson, the local pastor, has been involved with a lot of human rights issues and has a particular interest in this issue that we'll be dealing with tomorrow. On Wednesday, we will have 3 people talking about Native Americans and how their experience with integration, segregation, particularly in Montana, kind of compares and contrasts with what went on in the rest of the country regarding black Americans. Ray Cross from the U of M Law School up here has a great deal of expertise in this field. He will be one of the 3 speakers for that particular group. And then on the 4th day, Thursday, Professor Michael Mayer, who teaches 20th century American history at the university and has long had a particular interest in the Brown versus Board of Education decision, will be giving a talk on the historic context of the Brown decision, how it came about, and what its meaning was. He's researched and written extensively in this area. I couldn't get off the phone with him when I called him and asked him to come and do this. He's quite excited about it. So we hope to see all of you here for the next 3 days, because it should be well worth your time. Certainly well worth the money. I'd like to introduce Betty Ammon, who will be moderating our panel this evening.
The last time I moderated a panel, nobody stopped when I asked them to stop. But with these 3 people, I think that we probably won't ever want them to stop. Welcome to the library. I'm so glad you're here. Don Spreitzer deserves a special knock on the head, pat on the back for creating this series and doing so much. Probably all these people need no introduction, but I had to have something to do with this session. Pat Williams, Linda McCulloch, and Ken Toole are all well-known in Montana, particularly well-known in Missoula. They'll each be talking about a different aspect of Brown versus the Board of Education. Pat will talk about kind of the background and history of the decision. Linda will talk about it as it applies to Montana schools, and then Ken will talk about where it hasn't worked in Montana, or people who don't want it to work. There's been a lot in the national press, a lot of PBS documentary type information about this decision, and I've noticed, and it actually piqued my attention, that in April 1951, a couple weeks after I was born, so you'll have to do the math really fast. I'm 53. African-American high school student named Barbara Johns led a walkout at Motown High School in Virginia. Now, that was one of the catalyst events for the ultimate decision in 1954. But what was most intriguing to me about Barbara Johns was that she went on to become a librarian. Now, it makes a lot of sense to me that she was courageous, she was feisty, she believed in equity and equitable services, all very logical for a librarian, right? So very logical that we would have a program like this here at the library. Well, what can I tell you about Pat Williams, our first speaker? He was our honored representative in Congress from 1979 to 97, Deputy Whip of the House and Chairman of the Committee on Post-Secondary Education, oversaw all kinds of committees, did so much for libraries in particular, for the arts. And when I moved to Montana in the late 80s, it was with a great deal of respect for Pat already, and I was so proud to come from a city to live in a city where he eventually settled. So I'm so pleased and honored to present Pat Williams.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We have a microphone there, and I assume we can all sit there, but I'm going to stand for more comfort. All those years flying back and forth from Washington on a plane got my back, and so I'm better to stand than sit these days. Well, we say time flies, don't we? 50 years. I can see people nodding their head yes. I thought that perhaps it might be informative and hopefully interesting to hear some about who we were and what we were doing 50 years ago. I will, of course, speak briefly about Brown and then leave that to my two esteemed colleagues and maybe join in a little at the end if we have time. But in talking with some folks about this, I thought that maybe, even though time flies, 50 years ago was just long enough that perhaps we need to recollect those times. Unlike our moderator, I had just started high school. And I was living in Butte. My folks owned restaurants. I was in the restaurant business myself later, prior to the career you know about. Being a high school student in the early and mid-50s, I was interested in a number of things, including, of course, as you'll remember you were, movies. And so with the help of my memory, called Google, I went back to recall what movies we were watching. Here's the ones I most quickly recollected when I saw them. Caine Mutiny. Dial M for Murder. Yeah. Jimmy Stewart's Rear Window, which was my favorite, may still be. And then some young, good-looking fellow named Marlon Brando starred in On the Waterfront. Music was important to us. And here are the songs that we hummed and danced to. Secret Love by Doris Day. Four Aces gave us 3 coins in a fountain, remember? Nat King Cole smiled at us like no one ever could as he sang the hit song from '54, Smile. And a fellow who was just beginning to hit his stride sang a song that 6 years later would become Jack Kennedy's theme song. Frank Sinatra sang Young at Heart. A young 22-year-old kid from Oklahoma came up and filled Joe DiMaggio's shoes in center field at Yankee Stadium, Mickey Mantle. Mantle married Marilyn Monroe. The career Korean War was on and Marilyn went to Korea. You can imagine. She came home, and as DiMaggio greeted her at the airport, she said, "Joe, you've never heard such cheering." "Oh, yes, I have," said DiMaggio. Ernest Hemingway, our neighbor from just across these mountains in Idaho, won the Nobel laureate for literature with Old Man and the Sea. He went to Cuba and built his dream home and set aside a small room for a library. Hemingway always said he wanted to have the perfect library. And when a friend of his from the New York Times was invited down to see and write about the home and the library, and walked into the library, he noticed it had not been filled, the shelves had not been filled with books yet. There was just one book on the shelves in this small room, and the book was Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. And the journalist said to his friend Hemingway, "Ernest, what other books are you going to have here?" And Hemingway said, "None. This is to be a perfect library." A British medical student named Roger Bannister ran a mile in 3 minutes, 59.4 seconds, 50 years ago. And out in the Pacific Ocean, you remember the times now, we're all scared out of our wits, remember? Out in the Pacific Ocean, an H-bomb was exploded on a tiny atoll called Bikini Island. There was a French military garrison near China, in a little country most people had never heard about, Vietnam. There was a little French garrison at a village named Dien Bien Phu. The Vietnamese, as with most people in most places, did not want outside aggressors, for any reason, armed in their country. The Vietnamese attacked that French garrison, and the French finally left that garrison and left Vietnam. The French had lost 2,200 soldiers in the standoff. That was too many for them. It was years later that we learned that the Vietnamese who kept coming had lost 22,300 people. That alone should have been a lesson for the United States later. Here in Montana, Hollywood was filming a movie in Glacier National Park called Cattle Queen of Montana. It wasn't a big hit, but it had 2 stars, Barbara Stanwyck and Ronald Reagan. And here in Missoula, the nation dedicated and opened what it first called the Aerial Fire Center. You know it, we know it, as the Smoke Jumper Center. The President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, flew out in Air Force One to cut the ribbon and give the opening speech. The Missoulian noted that Eisenhower's visit to Montana lasted exactly 44 minutes. And that year, the same President Eisenhower threw the switch on the national Christmas tree, an Engelmann spruce, brought to Washington, D.C. from Montana. I wasn't paying a lot of attention to it, frankly, as a high school kid, but once in a while I'd see it on the news, as would you. And that is that a number of states in the United States had 2 sets of drinking fountains. And over one of them was a sign that said, for whites only. Hotels, restaurants, even bathrooms were segregated. Black people, look at the display perhaps as you leave tonight and before you exit the building. It has some of the photographs to remind us of those times. Black people were tortured and lynched and beaten and hanged indiscriminately. Primarily, but not exclusively, in the South. Racism in America, this land of liberty and freedom and equality, was absolutely rampant, North and South. An entire group of Americans were made to sit in the back of democracy's bus, and we either didn't care or we supported it. Little boy left Chicago, traveled down to Mississippi to see his grandparents. He was only 14. His name was Emmett Till, and he was sitting on the street with a bunch of little friends he'd just made that summer in Mississippi. And a couple of guys walked by, and one of them's wife was there, and somebody in that crowd whistled. Or so it was said. And that night, some thugs and cowards, hooligans, criminals broke into Emmett Till's grandparents' home and drug him out of his bed. They thought he was the one that whistled. They took him off and beat him unmercifully, tortured him, shot him, threw him in the river. They were tried in Mississippi. 2 of them let go, found innocent. They later, for a healthy sum, confessed their story to a national magazine. But of course, they'd been found innocent by then and couldn't be tried again. The case has been reopened because it appears that those 2 fellows, dead now, of old age and God's justice, were not alone. And so perhaps that little kid whose life was snuffed out simply because of the color of his skin will have his death somehow meeting some justice. It wasn't all in the South. Over in Topeka, Kansas, a little 9-year-old named Linda Brown could walk to a good school just down the street. But the problem was she was black, had black skin, and so she was bused for 2 hours to a school where only black children were allowed to go in Kansas, in Topeka. Her dad, Oliver, didn't think that was right. It wasn't that the school she went to was a bad school. It wasn't. In fact, it was a pretty good school. It's just that he didn't think that his little Linda should have to, at the dictates of the state, and the segregationists and the racists, be bused uncomfortably as a little girl early in the morning on a 2-hour trip. You know, in those days, not all the black schools were good. In fact, almost none of them were. I looked it up. The median expenditure for white student education was 3 times higher than that spent on a black student going to an all-black school. Maybe that was one of the reasons that in the 1950s, only 2% of black people, black students, ever attended college. What a great waste of talent that was, and remains in this country. We are not so rich that we can write off an entire group of citizens based on skin color, ignoring their brilliance and all that they have to give to this country. So it was a period of racism and forced inequality, the abuse by states' rights, intolerable segregation. The efforts of Oliver Brown for his little sweet 9-year-old girl would not have become a legal case without the efforts of the NAACP and its chief counsel, Thurgood Marshall, who would later become Justice of the United States Supreme Court. As you know, and you may hear, Brown versus Board of Education was a combination of 5 lawsuits. The Supreme Court accepted the case in 1951, and it was very divided. The Chief Justice was a conservative judge named Fred Vinson. However, in 1953, Vinson died, and President Eisenhower appointed the former Republican governor of California, Earl Warren, to Vinson's vacant seat on the court. That was a decision that Dwight Eisenhower would later call the worst decision I ever made. Shortly after that appointment, Ike invited Earl Warren down to the White House for dinner. And Warren reported that Eisenhower said this to him: "Earl, Southern whites are not bad people. All they are concerned about is to see that their sweet little white girls are not required to sit alongside some overgrown Negroes in classrooms." Misunderstanding, if you don't like calling it racism, reached all the way to the Oval Office and infected some otherwise very nice people. It has been almost a century since the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And yet, that half century ago, there were cross burnings, lynchings, torture, outright deprivation supported by the majority of our citizens throughout this country. Black people in most states in which they lived could not register and could not vote. They entered movie theaters through separate doors. In short, as I've said, we lived in an entirely segregated society. And then on a Monday, just like this Monday, and on this date, 50 years ago, the worst decision that Dwight Eisenhower ever made this statement. Unanimously, this court has concluded that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. There wasn't a single dissenting jurist. Now it is for us, 50 years later, to finally join in that unanimity. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. I had the shivers a couple times there. Well, our next speaker is Linda McCulloch, who is currently the State Superintendent of Education of Schools. I actually rode to Bozeman with Linda a long, long time ago to my first Montana Library Association conference when she was a school librarian at Bonner School. And I read something in the paper last week about her that I thought I'd share with you. If you haven't seen last week's Independent, they always have street talk where they ask various questions, topical questions of people on the street, and print their answers. And it's always the first thing I read, because sometimes I know people who are responding or who are addressed. The question last week was, who is the sexiest public figure in Missoula? And One of the answers was Linda McCulloch. What a hot woman in education. When you have a superintendent who is smart, it's really sexy. So, without further ado,
Definitely without further ado. Gee, if I'd have just remained an elementary school teacher and a school librarian, I'm not sure I would have gotten on that list. So anyway, thank you. Thank you to the Missoula Public Library. Thank you to the foundation. Thank you to all of you for coming this evening. And it is my great honor to be here on a panel with both Pat Williams and Ken Toole. What a pleasure and what an honor that is. And allow me just for a couple of minutes to be the elementary school teacher and school librarian, because there are some folks in here. I'm wondering, are you guys getting extra credit for coming here tonight? Okay, we can sign anything you need, so just in case. All right. Allow me just for a second to be the teacher, but I am your state superintendent of public instruction for Montana. It's a statewide elected office, and as such, the state superintendent is one of the 5 members of the executive branch of government. Remember that 3-legged stool from government class, which I understand they still teach, where you have the judiciary branch, you have the legislative branch, you have the executive branch, which in Montana consists of the governor, the attorney general, the auditor, the secretary of state, and the state superintendent of public instruction. So it is my honor to be here this evening representing the state superintendent's office and the executive branch of government. In 1954, the year of Brown v. the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, is a year that we not only remember because of the Brown versus the Board of Education, and in 2004 we're not only celebrating the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education, but we also in the year 2004 are going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the birth of Linda Harmon McCulloch. This was also the year in which I was born, and yes, this year I will be joining AARP, and it's just shocking to me, so, but I understand there are shopping discounts, and so I've gotten over it, so. But it is something that has been very relevant to me, and very important to me, as you know, I was destined to be a teacher and especially a school librarian, because in elementary school, you know, we did some research on what happened in the year you were born. And early on in elementary school was when I realized that the Brown v. Board of Education took place in the same year that I was born. And so it has always been something I thought of as being very personal to me, and not just a national public event, but very personal in the life of Linda Harmon. And for those of you that don't know me, I grew up in the Midwest and came to Montana in the 70s when I got married to my husband Bill, who still lives here in Missoula, even though by law I have to live in Helena. Not a perfect arrangement, but we're making do. But I grew up in Ohio and grew up in a very, very poor family and lived in the section of town where the black families, the colored families live. And so I have somewhat of a background. One of the things that a friends and I used to do, and I used to get chased away, but nevertheless, you know, as your kid, you come back and do it anyway. Every week, we would via boxes outside of a window in a cinder block church, would watch the American Negro church services on one week, Wednesday or Thursday evening during the week. And so I come by my love of black gospel music very honestly, because that's what we used to watch out the windows of the church. And so Brown v. the Board of Education is very personal to me. And I was listening on the way over here to NPR, and I don't know if any of you heard this. It was very moving because what they did, and I missed kind of the introduction to it, what they did was read actual letters that folks in 1954, following the decision, had written to President Eisenhower. And these were letters that were written, you know, on May 17th or shortly thereafter. A number of the letters were folks congratulating the president for making sure that desegregation would be taking place. A number of the letters were the kind of letters, and by the way, these were actual letters, so they used folks' real names and where they came from. Some of the letters would have given you chills to listen to folks speak the way that they spoke of African Americans, and it would have given you chills. But the letter that they ended with, and thankfully this is the letter they ended with, was from a 10-year-old girl who wrote to Mr. President and said, I don't understand. I want to know, I don't see any real difference between colored people and white people, and I want to know what that difference is and what the big deal about this is. And so it was an excellent letter to end with and an excellent thought to think about. Let me just, being the school librarian, I need to know where we are and I need to know where we're going, but I also need to know how we got to where we are. And so I spent quite a bit of time, and God love you, Pat, but you did research, and every librarian loves anyone who did research and then talks about it out loud publicly. And so let me just walk you through, and I've got pages after pages, and I won't go through them all with you, of pertinent things that led up to the 1954 and where we are today, and pertinent things in Montana. But 1868 gave us the 14th Amendment, which said that we were all equal before the law and the government. At this time, many states outlawed having Negroes to be educated in schools. It was against the law in many states. 1896 gave us Plessy versus Ferguson, which was, of course, what Brown v. Board of Education overturned, which said separate is okay as long as it's equal. World War II was actually a very significant period of time for this, because almost 1 million African Americans enlisted to fight in a segregated military at that time. And what we find is that in 1940, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, 1940 had a membership of about 50,000 people. By 1946, following World War II, the NAACP membership had grown from 50,000 to 450,000. And so, of course, in 1947, President Truman desegregated the armed forces. And then we find 1954, May 17th, Brown v. the Board of Education, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. And as Pat has told you, actually this was a culmination of a number of cases in different states. They frankly picked Kansas one because they wanted folks to think that it was not just a Southern issue. The interesting thing is that in Kansas, during this period from 1951 to 54, there were actually 13 lawsuits that were filed dealing with the segregation issue. And I point this out because in the year of the Million Women March in Washington, D.C., I think this is quite pertinent. 1954, 12 of the 13 folks who would file these suits were women on behalf of their children. And at that time, the folks who were organizing the lawsuit did not feel that the courts would give justice to a lawsuit that had a woman's name on it. And so Oliver Brown was the only one of the 13 in Kansas, the only man whose name was on the lawsuit. And so that is why Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas became the name. Interestingly enough, the Board of Education's main argument for this was that segregation in schools was a good thing because it prepared children for a lifetime of segregation, and that was the value of segregating schools at that time. As Pat told you, Linda Brown had a local school district 7 blocks from her house. Instead, she had to walk over a mile to get to the bus, and that mile was not an easy walk. It was through a railroad changing yard, which was very dangerous. It crossed a main boulevard, a main street in her city that was, again, very dangerous for her to cross in order to get to a bus, which she spent quite a bit of time on getting to her school. So there were a number of factors in this case. And actually, her father, Oliver Brown, didn't really want to file the case. And the folks convinced him. They said, well, you know what, just go in and try to register her for the local school in the neighborhood. And trying that, he was then convinced it was the right thing to do. 1955, Brown 2, the Supreme Court issued what's called Brown 2, which stated to folks in schools in the United States to desegregate with all deliberate speed. 1957, Arkansas, that was where we saw the 1,000 paratroopers sent to protect the 9 black students who had been sent in to enter the all-white school. 1963, March on Washington, that's where hundreds of thousands were demanding equal opportunities, not only in education, but in employment, housing, and so on. 1963, again, President Kennedy sends the National Guard to the University of Alabama, where Governor George Wallace had thrown himself over the entrance, not allowing black students to enter the university. 1964, the Civil Rights Act came about then, and so I think that the Brown v. Board of Education was very instrumental in making sure that that was passed. 1965, and here we come very pertinent, 1965 was the first Elementary and Secondary Education Act passed by Congress, ESEA, and that was guaranteeing that all children have a fair and equal opportunity to high-quality education. It was the beginning of the Title I programs. 1966 saw the National Education Association, NEA, merged with the All-Black American Teachers Association. Let's see, let's give a few of these. 1972 was very pertinent to us in Montana. Congress passed the Indian Education Act, ensuring more resources to Native American students, and also passed the Title IX Education Amendment prohibiting sex discrimination in education programs receiving federal funding. 1975, Congress passed the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, which later became IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act, which started in 1997. 1988, school integration reaches an all-time high. Almost 45% of black students are attending majority white schools. Through 1988, we had something called the NAEP test, which we still have today. It's considered the national test. It's National Assessment of Education Progress. And scores for black students were on the rise steadily from the time the 1954 decision up through 1988. In 1988, that starts reversing itself, and black and Hispanic student academic achievement stops rising and in fact starts declining. 1991, the Supreme Court makes it easier for schools to fulfill the court obligations to desegregate. By easier to fulfill, it means that they're less likely to need to desegregate. And it begins a steady abandonment of desegregation efforts in school districts across the country. 2002, Harvard Civil Rights Project research. More and more schools are becoming resegregated. And research that students from integrated schools are more, the research also included information from students all along from the 60s and 70s that showed that those students who had been in integrated schools are more and more comfortable with diverse cultures around them. 2002, President Bush's No Child Left Behind Act, which is the first of the ESEA acts to ever incur sanctions to low-performing schools. And frequently, these low-performing schools are the segregated schools, they're the low-income schools, they're the high minority group for schools. 2003, we saw the White House opposing equal opportunity in higher education. And then today, 2004, March 17th, May 17th, Brown v. the Board of Education, the 50th anniversary. Let me just give you a couple of interesting facts. Reading scores were tracked during this research, during this time, and in 1971, these are reading scores of 13-year-olds. Now, keeping in mind that we know from research repeated over and over again that if students aren't reading at their grade level by the end of third grade, it's nearly impossible to catch them up. That's one of the biggest factors in graduation rates or lack of graduating. 1971, there was a 39-point difference between black children and white children in their reading scores. 1988, that had been reduced to an 18-point difference in reading scores. 1999 saw an increase up to 29-point difference in reading scores. let me talk about just a bit about how this plays in Montana. And, you know, I will say that the Brown v. Board of Education decision, I think, forever changed the way that this country views its responsibility to provide a quality education for all students, regardless of their race or their social background. And it went far beyond tearing down the institutions of segregation, and it impacted every community in the country. And one of the things that impacted greatly, we see every day here in Montana, and that's Montana's 1972 Constitution. Drew heavily from the Brown decision. Article 10 sets out a number of things, education goals and duties for our states. Section 1 clearly forcefully states, as Montana's goal as a people, to establish a system of education that will develop the full education potential of each person. Equality of educational opportunity is guaranteed to each person of the state. Section 2 recognizes the distinct and unique cultural heritage of American Indians and is committed in its education goal to the preservation of their cultural integrity. Section 3 requires the legislature to provide a basic system of free, quality, public elementary and secondary schools, and that funding is distributed in an equitable manner to the school districts. It's interesting that in the 1988 equity lawsuit for Montana schools and also in the 2004 adequacy lawsuit, both Judge Lobel and Judge Sherlock both quoted from the Brown decision in their decisions on the respective lawsuits. And what they quoted was, the importance of education is universally recognized in our society. In an often quoted passage from Brown v. Board of Education, the United States Supreme Court aptly described the role of education. And just to paraphrase that quickly, today education, this is the Brown v. Board of Education, today education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. Compulsory school attendance and the great expenditures for education both demonstrate our recognition of the importance of education to our democratic society, and it goes on from there. It's an interesting thing because Brown v. Board of Education does talk about compulsory education, and the 6 years I spent in the legislature, it was interesting that in the late 90s that there were a number of bills brought before the legislature to abolish compulsory education in Montana. In other words, to say that if your 6-year-old child did not want to go to school, they didn't have to go to school. And so, interesting thing in Montana. We've made progress in Montana, but we have much left to do. Significant academic achievement gaps that still exist in the performance of minority and white students in Montana are American Indian children enter school in Montana with about a 5,000 word vocabulary, 5,000 words, compared to about 20,000 word vocabulary for non-Indian first graders. Those of you in the room, you're here in the library because you're probably good library users and good readers and can understand that the magnanimous effort that you need to catch a child up with a 5,000 word vocabulary to be able to read and read at a proficient level. Another thing that's still unacceptable in Montana, 78% of white Montana fourth grade students, 78% of Montana fourth grade students are proficient in reading, compared to 50% of American Indian fourth grade students, and this is according to our 2003 Iowa test results. This 50% is an increase over the last number of years, which tells us we're going in the right direction, but we're not there yet. And then lastly, and I find this most troublesome, about half of our American Indian students in Montana do not graduate from high school. Now, running through your minds are all the things that happen to a person without a high school diploma, which includes social problems, economic problems, often criminal problems. And so, you know, there are a number of reasons why getting a diploma is a very good idea. And the fact that we have almost half of our American Indian students in Montana do not graduate from high school is criminal. That again has been increasing the last few years, but we have a long way a long way to go on that. The reasons for these differences are many, and they're complex, and they involve the effects of grinding poverty, misguided federal and state education policies and programs, lack of state and federal resources, lack of American Indian teachers. Let me just pause here for a moment and tell you a story about that I think of whenever I think of the fact that we don't have role models for Indian students. That our Indian ed specialist a few years back went into schools, and it was an Indian school, went on one of our reservations, talked to the children about what do you want to be when you grow up? I mean, think of it, anything you want, what do you want to be when you grow up? And one little American Indian student said, I want to be a teacher's aide. And she said, well, why don't you want to be the teacher? And the child said, well, because Indians aren't the teacher, they're the teacher's aide. Isn't that a sad thought? More persistent racist attitudes, and we still have those, and limited economic opportunities once kids do graduate. Keeping in mind that our minority population in Montana are American Indians. It's about 11%, the students are about 11% of our student population in Montana, even though the Indian population in Montana is about 6 to 7%. And we know from the community and the cultural and the family culture of Indians that folks would like to stay in their communities, would like to stay near their families. But keeping in mind that many of our reservation communities have, on the average, a 50 to 70% unemployment rate. Some of the things that we've been doing at the office to work on this is we know that reading is critical, absolutely paramount to success in school. We've gone after competitive grants to the tune of about almost $35 million in the last 2 years. Money that goes right into schools, not money that goes into schools for $2,000 and you can buy a few books for the library, which is a good thing, but it's not going to turn around reading scores. And so money that puts some significant funding into schools to actually do some good with our low-performing schools in reading. We've actively just recently gone after an Indian dropout grant that will actually go into our Indian communities and work with students and teachers and families there to get the attendance rate up for school, but then also to work on the graduation rate. Indian Education for All funding. If you remember back when I was in the legislature, 1999 session, the legislature affirmed the Constitution, which said the unique and cultural heritage of American Indians, and that it needs to be passed down to our schools and our communities. And so Governor Roscoe at the time convened a group of folks who went about figuring out what we need to do in our schools to make sure that this is a reality in our schools. Now remember, this was not just to teach Indian children about Indian culture, but it's to teach all students in Montana about the cultural heritage of Indians. And so, you know, we have at the recommendations of Governor Roscoe's committee put forth bills for very small sums of money in the last 2 legislative sessions, about $60,000 a year to start with some curriculum materials, get some materials out into our schools and so on. The legislature has not funded that in the last 2 legislative sessions. We will continue to put forth that request. And frankly, in the recent Judge Sherlock decision, one of the big items that he mentioned repeatedly in there was that we had done nothing for Indian Education for All in Montana. And then lastly is helping to reform the No Child Left Behind Act to meet the needs of reservation communities. One of the things that we're finding in our Indian communities in Indian country is that with the focus of No Child Left Behind on reading and math test scores, many of our reservation schools and communities are concerned that there's no time in the day, there's no emphasis, there's no funds for making sure that kids also learn about their heritage, and that's something that will be lost because the emphasis is reading and math. And so, you know, also this is the first federal law that's actually had sanctions to schools, and those schools that are being sanctioned are predominantly those schools in low-income areas, those schools that have high population of minority students in Montana. And what it does is point out those schools as being failures without much funding to help them get out of that situation. One of the premises of No Child Left Behind is that, and this may be true, whenever I have criticized portions of No Child Left Behind, I've done it with the understanding that I'm talking about Montana schools. I've taught here all my life. That's what I know. I'm not sure whether No Child Left Behind is just the thing that Baltimore or Chicago needs, but I know Montana schools. And one of the premises of No Child Left Behind is that low-income schools are the ones that usually get the teachers who are not prepared, not licensed, as they say, subpar teachers. In Montana, that's not the case. We're very good at licensing teachers, and our low-income schools have the same percentage of properly licensed teachers as our high-income schools do in Montana. So we have some other issues we'd like to work forth, and we'd like to not be bogged down by some of the things in No Child Left Behind that truly are not going to be something that we need to help us in Montana. So with this, I will end and take questions anytime. Thanks.
Thanks, Linda. Well, our last speaker, and we'll have time for questions and comments when Ken is finished, and all three of our panelists would be glad to engage in a dialogue with you, I'm sure. Ken Toole is the co-director of the Montana Human Rights Network. He has been for over 10 years. He's also a state senator. Our daughter, who was a legislative intern in the last session, Katie DeBruyne, worked for the Northern Plains Resource Council, and she would come home and talk about the Kenator. She said that's what they all call Senator Toole. I asked my husband if he thought that would be okay if I said that. So it's all his fault if it isn't. Ken's spoken in Missoula a number of times. He's so heavily involved in human rights issues. He's published a number of articles. He serves on a number of boards. He's just a good guy. And he'll talk to us, let me see, specifically, focusing on how Brown relates to politics today. Ken Toole.
Thank you, and thank the library. I should point out, I also did research for this, but my research was grabbing a book half an hour before it started and going through it. And it's an excellent book. I read a number of years ago, and if people are interested, it's called Roads to Dominion, and it's about the rise of the new right. It's by Sarah Diamond, and I'll be talking about some of the things that are in that. But first, I should explain to people what the Human Rights Network is and give you a little brief history of the work that we do and have done in the past. The network really started in the late 1980s when white supremacist groups were kind of showing up in Montana, bleeding out of the Idaho Panhandle. There was this concept floating around then that they would make the 5 northwestern states the new Aryan homeland. And at that point in my life, I tended to define racist or racism really with that image of a Klansman or an Aryan Nation guy with his swastika and epaulets marching up and down the street, overtly and openly racist. And really that's kind of the way that I thought about what racism was, what the racist movement was in America. And of course, I'd gone through high school and college and understood the civil rights movement, understood at least parts of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s and what had gone on there. And I think this is very common for people who grew up in Montana. I mean, I graduated from Corvallis High down here in this liberal enclave south of Missoula. My personal experience with people of color was really non-existent. And everything I knew were things that I had picked up through the media or through my education, and certainly were not based in any level of personal experience. And so as the network was starting, what we saw ourselves as was a group of citizens who were concerned about the proliferation of this kind of hardcore white supremacist ideology that was also very laced with advocacy of violent activity, and then when you looked at the history of the groups and individuals involved, also a lot of violent and kind of covert criminal activity. And that's where I started in this kind of work. And the network in those days was, I think, not very not very controversial at all, because really what we were talking about were groups who were, I think, universally or almost universally reviled in society, or at least pushed away to the fringes. But as we did that work, I began to read things coming out of this movement and ran into a phenomenon called constitutionalists. Now, constitutionalists to me didn't have any kind of negative connotation, because I graduated from high school in the Bitterroot Valley and grew up with a lot of people who were very active in the Birch Society, Posse Comitatus, and I knew that their views were kind of political fringe, but I had never really associated that with racism in any way. But as I began to look at the overt white supremacist movement that we were seeing in Montana and see some of the ideas that these groups were advocating, it began to occur to me that, you know, these guys are really no different. And where, if the rubber meets the road within, depends what you want to call them, Freemen, constitutionalists, Christian patriots, a number of these groups, very active in Montana communities, is a concept of 14th Amendment citizenship. And of course, this is critical to the Brown decision. And in their political philosophy, there are two statuses of citizens. And one is a so-called organic citizen, which is essentially a white Christian male. They get their rights from the Constitution, the preamble, and the first 10 amendments. That's a divine document. Their rights come through that document from God, and their God-granted rights can't be abridged by men. And then they have this other status of citizenship, which is 14th Amendment citizens, or citizens who are federal citizens who have their rights granted through the 14th Amendment, and it's a whole different status of rights. And as you read through their documents and read through the court filings and their political analysis, what you begin to get is these two statuses clearly follow racial lines. Even I, the poor kid from Corvallis who grew up with all these folks, had to concede that they may be nice people, but if the world was ordered in the way they want it ordered, you would have different rights for different groups of people split along color lines. And that was kind of an expansion for me and how I looked at least personally, what the movements that the Human Rights Network was concerned about. And it began to include these constitutionalists or patriots who I think by anybody's measure are not very politically viable. That occasionally they get a county commission slot, they get about 51% of the state legislature, but by and large they're not a driving force in politics. But that was a period where we were learning at the Human Rights Network that this race thing just isn't as cut and dried as we thought it was. And then about '92, we began to see the activities of the Klan down in Billings. People may remember this as the whole "not in our town" thing. A Jewish doctor had a brick thrown through his window. The community got upset. The Indian community got a little upset that nobody was upset when bricks went through their windows, but there was a lot of discussion about this. But what we began to notice is that the Klan and the hardcore racist groups around the Northwest, when they were recruiting people and trying to bring people into their movement, they weren't saying, you know, come and join me, I'm a blathering racist. What they were really talking about was homosexuality. They were talking about the decline in public education. They were talking about abortion. They were talking about gun rights. And through those issues, we're beginning to establish kind of a common ground with people to move them into what I think is pretty, by anybody's definition, a pretty radical view. But it caused our group to really look at, well, what are these other kind of much more mainstream political forces that are driving the kinds of activities that we were seeing in Billings and the other stuff that we were seeing around the state. And to make a long story short, our board went through, I think, a fairly deliberative process and said, you know, there's this phenomenon out here, we call it the new right or the religious right or the Christian right, which looks very different than the racist movement and the Aryans and all of these folks, but they're advocating for a lot of the same things. And most importantly, they're advocating for these ideas that not all citizens have access to the pie, and that there are different levels of citizenship, and there are different rights based on, or different benefits of society that we should get, and a definition of society American society that we felt was very much a narrowing to essentially seeing America as kind of a white and Christian bastion, and advocating for that vociferously in the political arena, major target being public education. And these groups are around today, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but they really do not like public education for a lot of very good reasons, but primary among them is public education is where the society is indoctrinated in the values of democracy. And people say we shouldn't teach values in public education. Well, what else should we be teaching in public education? Certainly that's a function. And in that way, if they don't like the way the country's going, it's absolutely rational that they target this institution to try and, I think, dismantle it, or at least change it in a way that reflects more their view of how society should be. And this comes to Brown, I think. This is how it can meander around. I'm supposed to be talking about Brown. I'm going to talk what I always talk about, but I'm going to say Brown several times. I think there isn't much question, at least from my perspective, and for those of you who don't know, I'm a liberal, proudly a liberal, stand up and say I'm a liberal in all these meetings. I don't think liberals are in power now, and I think, in fact, what we've been seeing in America is, well, listen to Rush Limbaugh. He thinks they're still in power. But what we've been seeing, I think, is really a dramatic shift to the right in the body politic. Not just these fringy, white supremacist, constitutionalist, patriot groups, but overall politics in America, and in large part, you find the roots of that around the Brown decision in the South. And what there clearly was segregationists were not very happy about Brown. And their response to Brown was basically revolt, out and out opposition, and we had numerous cases that Linda and Pat just went through of confrontation between state power and federal power, which is another theme within the right that I think this country has wrestled with since its founding, certainly during the Civil War that was brought into it, the war between the states, as they like to call it, was brought into a clear, bright focus about the tension between federal power and state power. But we saw the formation of segregation academies following the Brown decision. The response then was that a lot of white parents through the South took their children out of public schools and formed all-white Christian academies or segregation academies to avoid desegregation. And the IRS came out and said, well, wait a minute, you really can't do that. This took place over a number of years. This wasn't instantaneous. It was after several armed confrontations. They come up with this strategy for dealing with desegregation. So we see the rise of white citizens councils. In essence, there is an intensive political organizing effort in the South around desegregation, formation of white citizens councils and segregation academies, some 250,000 members by the late 50s in a political movement. At the same time, we're seeing an increase in kind of the anti-communist organizing around the Birch Society, the Goldwater campaign. As time goes on, you've got the Goldwater campaign serving as a catalyst or a focal point for much of the kind of America First, ultra-nationalist, anti-communist sentiment in the country, which was building through the McCarthy era, et cetera, and the Wallace campaigns pulling together these segregationist forces through the South, and we've got George Bush. So I don't want everybody to get tired out on this, but the point is that through that period, it was intensive political organizing. And the organizers of the new right were adopting an internal strategy within the Republican Party to dramatically move the Republican Party to the right. They were pressuring through those kind of institutions within the Republican Party and also outside the Republican Party with third-party efforts, all the while moving that institution dramatically to the right. And we began to see through, I think his name was Kevin Phillips, in the Nixon era, the emergence of the Southern strategy, the Republicans beginning to realize that race issues could break Democratic hegemony in the South and deliver electoral majorities. When I think the real defining moment when the new right delivered real presidential political power was Ronald Reagan. And that was clearly a time where they demonstrated not only that they were a force to be reckoned with, but they really could deliver political power. And since that time, I think they're probably the major driving political force when you look at all these subsets, organized labor and blah, 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 that the religious right and that old mix of kind of the anti-communist right and the segregationists in the South is now front and center. So it's no surprise that on the national stage in our political debate, English only, affirmative action, immigration reform, issues of race are once again, I think, central to a lot of the political debate in this country. And I think we're resegregating, and Linda's figures about reading levels, I think, are a very dramatic indication of what's going on. And now the segregation, I think, is occurring through economic policy as much as it is kind of social policy. And that the economic track that we're taking in this country is just, without a doubt, leading to increased racial segregation. And so that's kind of how I think Brown, and a number of other decisions, it wasn't Brown, but I think Brown really was what poured gas on Southern evangelicals organizing as a political force along with the televangelists Falwell, Robertson, et cetera, bringing them into the political arena. Now, what's interesting to me is if you look at what's happening today, those folks are much better about dealing with base and understanding, motivating their political base than we are. And we being liberals, Democrats, however you want to put that. And if I just want to point out that in Montana, we're now starting into a presidential election. And what I see happening is those strategists on the new right are dropping electrodes into their base and turning on the juice. And if you want to just look around our state, we've had just in the last 6 months a 10 Commandments dispute up in Kalispell, which just, this is the kind of stuff that really motivates their folks to get out and work. The creationism fight that we just had down in Darby. And granted, our team won that one. I think it took a lot of political organizing. And thank you very much for your work in that area. We won that one, but again, it's a matter of energizing base and getting people agitated to be active in the political arena. The Diversity Day thing here in Missoula last night, or night before last?
Week ago.
Oh, was it a week ago? Sorry. Time compresses when you get over 50. I'll find out in a couple of years. So that's another example. We just had an evolution book challenge in Helena. Evolution of Horses, I think, was the book that was challenged. Again, that gets those folks organized and thinking about the political arena. We had a leafleting in Great Falls last week, anti-gay, anti-Islamic, anti-everything, and it was Constitutionalist Party folks out leafleting in front of Great Falls High. Students went out and made posters and went out and kind of confronted them, so I think there's great hope. And then, of course, the gay marriage ban, which I think is going to be the big issue that they're using to try and mobilize these social conservative forces. And I think we're seeing that very much here in Montana. Just get those folks up and moving so they participate in the political arena. Hopefully this time it won't be enough to carry the day, although it's been enough to carry the day for quite some time. So I think that when you look at how the right has been organizing, how effectively they really have taken power in the U.S. and in Montana in a lot of ways, a lot of it goes right back to Brown and segregation in the South. So, thanks.
Questions, comments? The first one's always so hard. Yes.
One article here, there's a magazine here called School Reform News, and there's an interesting piece of news. It says, after a decade of effort by citizens and legislatures, Governor Gary Locke on March 18th signed into law a charter school bill for Washington State that will permit the creation of 45 charter schools over the next 6 years. The bill was passed by a vote of 651 to 46 in the Democrat-controlled House and 27 to 22 in the Republican-controlled Senate. That makes state number 40, I believe. It does have charter school legislation. I'd like to get the comment of the panel on this.
And those mics are hot. You can keep your eye on.
In Montana, let me just back up a little bit. We have no statutes, nothing in our laws, administrative rules or whatever, that would prohibit charter schools in Montana. Legislation that's been issued has been put forth in the legislature for about the last 10 years, which has been called charter school legislation, has in fact not really been charter school legislation. It's been legislation to put public funds into private schools, to use vouchers, to use tax credits. And so, you know, frankly, the whole issue of charter schools has been distorted in Montana because it's been used for really voucher type bills. Charter schools can be done anytime in Montana as long as you follow the health and safety standards that other schools in Montana have to follow, as well as other practices that other schools in Montana have to follow. Now, most of the bills that have been put forth by the legislature have been bills that have been made to get around having licensed teachers in classrooms, have been made to get around having you know, Disability Act and sort of safety standards to follow, and getting around having schools that don't use the accreditation standards in Montana. So, you know, so we've sort of distorted the conversations about charter schools in Montana due to bills that are really more voucher and tax credit private school bills.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, and I'm not sure I understand the distinctions between charter schools and voucher programs. What I guess I'm concerned about is I think there has been a conscious effort to undermine the institution of public education in the U.S. And it starts with, I think, a critique of public schools that's unjustified. And if you think about it, and I don't want to be a quote-unquote apologist for the problems in the public system, but in fact, in the U.S. we have the laudable goal of everybody getting an education. I don't, you know, that's unique in history that we have this level of commitment to education to everybody in society. And one of the greatest examples, I think, of this is the critique about SAT scores and sliding SAT scores and all of the information that's put forward about that. But clearly one of the reasons, to the extent that's true at all, is that more people are taking the SAT from different backgrounds, and that's caused some erosion, or at least there's an argument that it's caused erosion. So is it a problem that we have more people aspiring to go to college than we have in the past? So, but again, I think there has been a long-term campaign to undermine public faith in public education. That's why I think these alternatives are beginning to pass here and there. In fact, I think that public education is absolutely critical for a democracy. Now, if you can do that with a charter structure,
Charter is a public school.
right, then I don't have a problem with that. But what I've seen and what you see advocated for out of the political right wing is essentially the idea that we take the kids we want to take, and we get the money that everybody's paying, which leaves essentially the public institutions being creamed, and I think leading to a decline. But again, I'm not expert on what's the difference between a charter and a voucher.
I know that charters have been initiated legislatively in California by Democrats and many places by people of the left. So that it's not a right-wing. Charter schools is not a right-wing thing. There's 40 states that have charter school legislation now, and most of these states have charter schools, and it gives more power to the parents. It gives more empowerment to the family, and it's a balancing thing. And it also gives a little bit of competition to people have a choice, some kind of a choice to say, gee, if this school isn't functioning properly, I can move over here. I think that's a very powerful thing. And I don't think it's something that we should just say is some sort of right-wing conspiracy. because it's not. There's many Democrats that feel this way, as shown by this vote in the state of Washington.
Well, I guess just, and not to get into a debate about this, I think that the voucher experiment in Milwaukee had support from various sectors, and clearly low-income parents were concerned about the quality of the schools in Milwaukee, and from what I've read, that hasn't worked out very well. But again, I'm not sure conspiracy is the word that I would use, but clearly the political right wing, probably more than any other institution, has in its sights defunding and restructuring public education in this country.
Pat, did you
No.
want Okay. Gigi?
We often associate Brown v. Board with the desegregation of children in schools. Could the panelists talk a little bit about the effect it had over the last 50 years on teachers, on black teachers who were in those segregated schools, who then had to face, in some cases, losing their jobs as schools were integrated? And I'm thinking in Montana of the Indian Education for All mandate that might bring more Indian teachers into our public schools to teach all children about Indian heritage, and the opportunity we would have to increase the number of Indian teachers to meet that constitutional goal.
There has been in the past two, perhaps more, but at least two state legislative sessions, a failed legislative effort, failed bills, twice by Representative Carol Juneau, to provide, all things being equal, all other criteria being equal, to provide a classroom job in a school predominated by Indian students, to provide that classroom job to an Indian, all other criteria being equal. The legislature has twice, the Montana legislature has twice turned that proposal down. And I've listened to and considered the debate. It's an interesting debate that says as much about us as it does about those making it. The debate is that Montanans don't like preferences. And I suppose we say we don't. Unless, of course, you happen to be a miner who wants to buy land for $5 an acre, and the federal government gives you a preference to do it. Or unless you happen to be a small business person who goes to the Small Business Administration for a small business preference set aside on your bids, or unless you happen to be a Montana veteran who enjoys employment preferences, all other things being equal, one hires the veteran. But when it comes to hiring, and those things, the Congress and many others, the Congress of the United States and the legislature has passed, usually overwhelmingly. But skin color's not involved. When skin color is involved, friends, that formula changes everywhere in this country, not just in the South. Brown v. Board set us on a social path. And as a people, we've decided, I suppose, that all deliberate speed means damn slowly. Because 50 years later, one can look at Indian schools in Montana and not see nearly enough Indian teachers. Now, Gigi, that doesn't directly address your question with regard to the dispossessed black teachers who had jobs in black schools and then couldn't get them in white schools, but I'm not confident enough in the history of that to directly address that part of your
It's
question.
just a springboard to talk about Montana.
Yeah,
where I
okay.
wanted to focus.
Sarah?
I'm just interested in the effect of Brown on homeschooling. It seems to me that it doesn't affect homeschooling at all, and is homeschooling an effort to avoid both integration and accountability and so forth.
I'll do this. Homeschoolers already hate me. Yeah, that's right. First of all, Montana is one of the worst states in the country as far as monitoring what's going on in homeschooling. And I got to know Randy Weaver. People know who Weaver was. He was in the shootout at Ruby Ridge. He moved to Kalispell. I went up and smoked cigarettes and drank beer with him in a failed attempt to convert him to liberalism. But developed quite a personal relationship with him, and I have signed books and all that stuff from him. But one of the things that he told me is he moved to Idaho, and his family moved to Idaho so they could homeschool. Because in Idaho, just like Montana, all you had to do was say you were doing it, and there was very little monitoring of the progress of the kids and what was going on. Clearly, a lot of people, first of all, clearly progressive liberal types homeschool, conservative types homeschool, and you can put the progressive types who homeschool over here and then fill the room with the political right that homeschools. So I'm acknowledging that there are certainly progressives who are homeschooling for a lot of reasons, but if you look at the institutions and the numbers and the homeschooling organizations, all of that come from a very conservative political perspective. All of them, and I think it's called Grapevine or something, is the publication for homeschoolers here. It very much has kind of a religious right political perspective. And I think it goes very much to the core of how the religious right in particular interprets the responsibility for education. People like me tend to think it's the responsibility of the community to educate children, that we all share an obligation to participate in that process, at least in terms of funding. On the other end, on the right end of the scale, the education of children is the responsibility of the family and only the family. And they can delegate then that responsibility to another school, or they can fulfill it themselves with a homeschool. And so I think that there definitely is a political perspective, and definitely it has to do with staying out of the cesspool of the rest of society and what's going on in the public system. The only other thing I'd add is I think the scariest thing about homeschooling in Montana is that it is used to neglect children.
I'd like to conclude my part of this by telling you about a thing that I began by mentioning some movies from the 50s. There was a movie called The Defiant Ones. Maybe you remember it. It was starring Tony Curtis and Sidney Poitier. And they were two prisoners chained together at the ankles with a long chain. They despised each other, part of it based on race. They escaped the prison. And they were running through the night holding the chain between them, still chained together. And running through the night to get away from this terrible prison. And in the darkness, they didn't realize, but they came across a great pit, a hole, and they fell headlong into it. And when they recovered, they tried scrambling out, but it was too high to reach the rim. And so these two people who despised each other realized that if one was to get out, the other would have to hold his foot and lift him up to the top. And then if the one who was out was to be free, he had to pull his despised friend up with him. Brown versus Board of Education affected every single one of us sitting in this room, because we all have black brothers and sisters. We all attend the same school. We all live in the same country. And none of us will be free until we're all free. Schools can help us get there more than any other American institution. That's why we have to pay more attention to it.
instruction, a longtime teacher, I just have to address this for just one moment, because we spend an awful lot of time politically talking about the amount of money spent in schools. What I think we should be doing is talking about the quality of our schools in Montana. What do we want to see as the quality of our schools in Montana? And that's a much harder discussion than just talking raw numbers. And oftentimes we have a group formed in Helena for the interim to talk about this. We've spent months talking about quality education. And whenever we excitedly talk about some program or something that we see that would be, good for our children in Montana, we have somebody from the Montana Taxpayers Association, because it's a consensus process, who says, no, I veto that because it would cost more money in Montana. So it's inhibited our whole conversation about what's the quality. What do we want to see our children come out with? What do we want to see our children be able to accomplish as high school graduates or college graduates or COT graduates in Montana? The conversation needs to be quality, not raw dollars. In Montana, if you're going to just talk raw dollars, think about the fact that we pay so much more for transportation in Montana than New Jersey pays for its students. It's not even comparable, but that's all thrown into the mix. We're very lucky that we have small class sizes and small schools in Montana, but another thing thrown into the mix is a severely cognitively delayed handicapped student, and the cost of that student could be astronomical cost, throws off the whole cost of what we're talking about for the per student costs. And so I would much rather see us, and we're going to be talking about this for months because we have a lawsuit decision coming up. And frankly, if both parties decide not to take it to the Supreme Court, that would be okay with me, because that gives us a gift. We have months to bring all the parties together, the Republicans, the Democrats, the education folks, and so on, to talk about how we're going to solve this problem together in Montana, and it must be solved because Judge Sherlock's watching and it has to be solved. And so, we need to discuss what it is we want to see for public education in Montana and not just talk about numbers. It's kids, not numbers.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much. This was terrific.